Hey everyone, Tony D with another in 10 minutes. I'm going to try to do Chinese communism in 10 minutes. Whew, it's a complicated topic. It's not going to be less than 10 minutes, that's for sure. So, how did the Chinese become a bunch of commies? Well, a lot of it has to do with World War II and the past of the Chinese history, which is also extremely complicated. But in a nutshell, you had China is like an amalgamation of a bunch of kingdoms that were united over the years, and we're talking about a civilization that's very old. So over the years, they accumulated a lot of bureaucracy and corruption, and it was the sort of system prior to World War II that, was having a lot of trouble sort of making that transition into the industrial world, if you can imagine that. I mean, now China is extremely industrialized, but back then there was still all this ancient stuff going on there. And so you had World War II happens, and the Japanese just run rampant all over China. And that didn't help the situation for the Chinese at all. The Japanese were extremely cruel. Imperial Japan did not believe in taking prisoners, so they just did whatever they wanted to people. And a lot of times, when they talk about Nanking, the Chinese to this day still remember that. The Japanese just went nuts, killing and torturing people and assaulting people. It was not a pleasant time for the Chinese. Coming out of World War II, the Chinese tried to recover. And the United States was very keen on keeping China in our orbit at the time. The leader of China was Chiang Kai-shek. And oddly enough, he was a triad, basically. For those of you who don't know what a triad is, triads are Chinese gangsters. It's a little more complicated than that because it's not just gangsters. Triads were like this complex, they're basically kind of fraternities. And the gangsters eventually sort of took over those fraternities, but there are also, and still are, some Chinese houses that aren't connected in any way to criminality. It's just they're kind of like men's clubs, but also schools and places to network. But obviously the triads were extremely motivated by money. They were originally part of a movement to restore the Ming Dynasty, and so there was a lot to the gangster triads that eventually pushed them into mostly taking over the sort of triad name. It's very complicated. When you're talking about China, nothing's easy. There's so many permutations because there's just so many people involved. So Chiang Kai-shek was incredibly corrupt. So if you can imagine like the mafia being in charge of the United States, you can kind of begin to imagine what it was like to have, gangsters run rampant through your country as big and as populated as China, even though they lost a lot of people during the war. But that was nothing to what was to come. But things were so bad and so corrupt, and World War II had so devastated things that the Chinese communists made a very appealing choice at that time. See, the thing about communism, it's not very appealing if you're well off, right? I mean, if you have money and you're doing okay, why would you want to become a communist? It doesn't make any sense. But if you're totally broke and you're struggling and you struggle from day to day just to put food on the table, well, a system in which says they get you guaranteed a job and food and medical care and all these great things, well, that sounds awesome. So that's why, I think for a lot of reasons that communism never really takes hold in the United States is because for the most part, people in the United States are pretty well off. And, they don't really know what it's like to be hungry and miss food for like 3 days and just barely struggle to stay alive. This is kind of what it was like to live in China, after the war. It was just a mess. And they struggled to put things back in order. And unfortunately, the United States, anxious to keep the Soviets out of their orbit, didn't help matters. It kind of was a sort of thing that by meddling in the affairs of the Chinese, we sort of ended up pushing them into the arms of the communists at the time, the Soviet Union. But it's also true that Chiang Kai-shek during the war played the Russians and the Americans off of each other, or the Soviets and the Americans off of each other. So, it wasn't like they were totally not open to the ideas, but they were mostly just out for themselves. The Communist Revolution eventually broke, and Mao Zedong took over and drove the guys that we supported, the United States, to Taiwan. And that's why, to this day, China wants Taiwan back, and the United States has this position like, oh no, you're not taking it. We're protecting those people because we're still kind of holding the line against the Chinese Communist Revolution, essentially. So far they've left Taiwan alone, but Taiwan again isn't any great shakes. It was pretty corrupt, and we helped that corruption along. But nothing's worse than communism, as people eventually found out. So Mao took over, and with his centralized government, people starved to death in droves, and people died. They went to the Gulag, and millions and millions of people were killed starved to death. Mostly starved to death. There were a lot of people killed, but most of them starved to death during Mao's tenure as chairman. He had sort of led a lot of people during World War II and right after, so, he was beloved by some, mostly ideologues who were in the top echelons of the government, but not really the people. We're talking about a time that was still very agrarian, and had been for years and years. And Mao kind of tried to wind the clock back, forcing people to go back to the farms and sort of equalizing everybody in their poverty, essentially. And that really didn't work because of him, millions and millions of people starved. He didn't really know anything about farming, and he would just make these pronouncements. They say towards the end of his life he had started to lose it, kind of like Stalin. And like Stalin, the moment he was dead, people breathed a sigh of relief, and there were guys who came in and started to make changes, and things instantly got better. Because just like Stalin, Mao was a tyrant. The guys who came after him were tyrants too, but he was a tyrant determined to hold on to power at any cost. So, after he died, they loosened things up a bit economically. They were still tyrannical. And so the markets kind of opened a little bit. And then over the years, they opened more and more. And now we have this weird mix of centralized government and kind of private industry, but not really. It's not very laissez-faire. It's more of a hyper crony capitalist kind of system. So imagine, if you would, that instead of the Soviet Union putting all their money into the military, they put most of their money into the infrastructure and starting businesses. It's kind of the Chinese. Now, they still developed weapons. For a lot of years, they were allies with the Soviet Union, and they benefited from that. Now that the Soviet Union's gone, they don't really benefit directly. The Soviet Union, their whole push was to eventually dominate the world. It wasn't just going to be communism for them. It was going to be communism for the entire planet. And so part of that deal was that the Soviets had to kind of succor, Cuba and China and all these communist countries and keep them going. Otherwise, they were full of S. You couldn't let any of these regimes die, or else they look bad in front of the Americans. But after the Soviets went away, the Chinese just kind of went off on their own. And now, really, in terms of communism, they're the big dogs. They're the Soviet Unions. And really, the only country they kind of succor is North Korea, kind of. But they don't have the same sort of drive to do that as the Soviets did. They're more about their own deal. And quite frankly, there's so many internal problems in China that, there's no way I could list them all. I mean, the main one that everybody knows about now is the Uyghurs, the Muslim Chinese group that is being horribly oppressed now, has been horribly oppressed, much like the Tibetans and the Tibetan monks. The Uyghurs they're really going after them hammer and tongs. So it's terrible what they're doing. And now, of course, everybody's talking about China because of Hong Kong, and they're coming down on Hong Kong. Hong Kong belonged to the British up until, I want to say, they gave it back, I think in 1999. They for some reason, the Brits had a deal that they would keep it for 100 years. I mean, it's weird that they put a sunset provision on that, but there you go. Had they not done that, they might have, still be running Hong Kong today. But that, unfortunately, is not the case. And I said in another video, I think the mainland government is going to slowly vampirize all the wealth out of Hong Kong. Not because they, don't like Hong Kong per se, or it's ideological. It's simply because the mainland Chinese government is super centralized. Hong Kong wasn't, at least not initially. Now it's becoming more and more centralized, and that causes failure. See, when one company fails and you got a bunch of different companies competing in any way they want, it doesn't matter. One company fails. But when you have a centralized government, and say you have one government to be the construction company for the entire country, if that company fails, what are you going to do for construction? There's no one immediately to take its place. All you could do is sort of prop up the corrupt one construction company system that you have. So centralization at the end of the day is really, 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 really bad. And because the people in power in China want to keep that power, they keep running the show. And until the entire system collapses, which it's heading towards a collapse, albeit very, very slowly, even before things in Hong Kong. I'm not suggesting that Hong Kong is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, but it is a long time coming that China will collapse. Their money, they do currency manipulation, they do all sorts of things that only a centralized government can do. That are extremely bad. Yes, there are some advantages to a centralized system, but at the end of the day, communists are just terrible with money. It's only going to take one or two big mistakes to hit at the wrong time, and they're just going to be done. The whole currency, everything will just collapse in on China. And then they're going to be left with a bunch of starving, angry people. And that's when the government may break. There may not be, if you don't have money to pay the troops to oppress the people, you're in big trouble. So anyhow, that is China, communist China in 10 minutes. It's a mess. I wish the Hong Kong protesters well. I hope they continue to sing songs of freedom. I hope the Chinese government sees the downside of their system somewhat, and I don't have high hopes that they're going to treat Hong Kong very nicely. I think at some point they're just going to pull the trigger and roll in there and kill everybody. I'm sorry. I'm not very optimistic about the Hong Kong protesters' chances. I hope that's not the case. I would suggest to the Chinese government, just work out a deal. Hong Kong's making you money. Keep collecting the money. Keep it separate. Don't just take people off to the gulag, because at the end of the day, the corruption will destroy your golden egg there, and you won't be able to fund anything once you destroy Hong Kong. And that's just a nail in the coffin of you economically. So it's in your best interest not to destroy Hong Kong. Don't do it. Don't do it, Chinese government. And good luck to the Hong Kong protesters. I hope you get out of Hong Kong before anything truly bad happens.